Let's try and make sense of it for you. Bring in political analyst Lukhona Mnguni, no stranger to the platform, and certainly a familiar voice around political developments. He joins us now via our video link. Lukhona, great to see you. Thanks very much indeed for making time at this time, no less. And we really are spoiled for choice about where we start with trying to make sense of what's happened here. But with the benefit of hindsight, now that we've heard what he's had to say, who do you reckon was the intended audience of yesterday's address?
A very good morning, Ayanda, and to your viewers. I think the intended audience really for the address is probably the top leadership of the EFF, more than the ground forces who were convened to make song and dance out of the address. I think this is a warning shot now in a serious and material way from Julius Malema as president of the EFF to those around him. I mean, when he talks about people wanting to choose those who remain silent when they are facing a difficult moment and are under attack, it's no doubt that in the last few days he has been trying to look quite carefully in terms of who is defending the EFF, who is silent. I mean, he even made a very petty statement about how people's spouses are liking certain material on social media because it's quite clear then that somebody at home has whispered to them in terms of where they are. So he's using a lot of proxy examples to tell us that, I am watching those I lead with, relatively trust very few of them, and a number of them seem to be here for opportunistic reasons. And I think really, that's the audience, because what this does is that it opens wide open a leadership scramble and a race within the EFF. Even if the position of president may remain untouched, it's not clear who then would become the deputy president, and Malema would have to be stuck with that person chosen by, the delegates of the National People's Assembly in December for the next 5 years. And even if he doesn't like the person who emerges, would have to pretend to do so for the next 5 years.
Sure. Depending who you ask, Malema either set the tone for whatever lies ahead. He admits that the organization is entering into a new era, or he was an unrestrained, unrestricted man spiraling on that podium. Where do you stand on that spectrum?
Look, I think he was trying to also lick his wounds. He probably doesn't necessarily believe where the EFF is and that, its demise would actually be under his leadership and his watch. There is no doubt that, even if they go around all provinces calling up, ground forces, filling up community halls and the likes, that is by no means a good barometer as to whether or not the EFF is losing ground. They will need to come up with much more greater organizational surveillance that enables them to gather enough intelligence about who may well be defecting. And of course, as we saw within the ANC ahead of the 29 May election, who may well be remaining within the ranks of the organization, but actually aiding the prospects of another political organization from within. And all of those things will need a degree of organizational intelligence beyond, rather than just, calling up ground forces to fill up a room and have a meltdown, really, because in some instances it did feel like a political meltdown of sorts from him. He didn't seem to be in charge of the moment, in charge of himself, his own emotions. And I suppose it may be too great an ask at this point in time to say that the leader should be entirely in charge of his emotions, in charge of how he comes across, because if indeed this is a massive breakup and rupture between him and Floyd Shivambu, and that I remain very skeptical about this entire thing, Ayanda, because we don't have enough information to make concrete conclusions as to what is going on. And I think with every episode, and I'm sure whenever Floyd Shivambu takes to podium within MK Party, he'll have an opportunity to tell his side of the story, and there we will begin to piece together the puzzles. Because like I said earlier last week to this channel, I still believe that there may well be another, a reasoning behind this. It may be testing the waters. It may well be that in future the EFF will continue to migrate towards MKP, and a merger is possible. Because if you hear them, they still sustain that they will work together as a progressive caucus in parliament and as progressive forces outside of parliament. Therefore, we need to hold those things in a constructive tension, whilst we know I mean, the EFF has to exist because it has representatives in municipalities, in legislatures, and in the National Assembly and in the National Council of Provinces. So you can't just close the EFF down and then say we are all going to MKP. So you need to manage those transitions carefully if that's what's happening. But if there's a significant leadership rupture here, I can tell you that Floyd and others will then raid the EFF of some of its ground forces, and the EFF finds itself in a very, very precarious position if that is the case.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I mean, the scenario that you just pointed out is one that's certainly been doing the rounds. This idea that this is more of a deployment than an exit, if you like, from Floyd Shivambu. And if that were to be the case, I mean, one has to wonder whether or not Malema may have crossed the line yesterday, because those salvos weren't veiled in some instances. You know, he took a direct shot at Floyd Shivambu. And you have to wonder, I mean, you know, among the questions being raised now is whether the personal relationship that both men have admitted to having has been severed by these very stark political tensions.
Look, I think there are certain relationships that transcend political choices, almost like in football, where people feel very passionately about their football teams, but you know, particularly the elites who are, I would say, are managers of football. Let's say now in this instance, the political actors and managers of the political landscape, as it were, because that's really why we are having this conversation, because political actors are seemingly drifting apart and reshaping the political landscape of South Africa. Amongst the elites, there's always a way in which people are able to find themselves. I mean, the two gentlemen are intertwined in a number of ways, not least in terms of a friendship, but of course, you know, even their own political patronage networks are same and similar in some instances. And then therefore, I think a lot ties them up together. I mean, if they were to really move apart, and then we would probably hear much more of less veiled salvos in future. I mean, it's almost like people who know where their skeletons are buried, or rather their dead bodies are buried for each other. And therefore, it's a very deep relationship. And when those relationships rupture, they do tend to actually cause a mutually destructive outcome for the people who are involved, both in politics and generally in life. When people who have spent a lot of time and know too much about one another, disassociate, it tends to be very ugly. And I hope that, for the benefit of South Africa's political landscape, their politics will remain rooted much more in politics of ideas, in politics of, thinking through what needs to be done for the country, rather than, these, malicious, dirty, personalized politics. Because what that will also do is that it will infuse in our political discourse and our national discourse something of a gossip kind of politics, which I don't think is healthy for anybody to be participating in.
Fair enough. He mentioned yesterday, this is Julius Malema, multiple times that, the organization's lifespan doesn't depend on any one person. But then in the same speech, almost seemed to make a unilateral decision to completely centralize power in his own office. I mean, it almost feels like there's this kind of duality even in his own thinking about what the future of the organization looks like and what it will take to survive this moment.
Well, look, I mean, there are so many contradictions, as you say, and I think it's because a part of Malema's politics is to pretend that the EFF is a highly and super democratic organization, which it is not. I mean, that's why he's able to discipline people in a press conference and determine what a fine will look like or make up things. I mean, for example, when, in the city of Ekurhuleni, Dunga was removed as MMC for finance, he gave a deadline to say that if within, I think, about 48 hours he's not reinstated by the ANC, the EFF will recall all MMCs across various municipalities. Of course, something that has not come to pass, because you can't make those kind of unilateral decisions. I mean, these are people's livelihoods. It's also about the image of the organization and so on. So you're quite correct that there are moments of contradiction. I mean, he said, here is your organization to the ground forces. Look after it, protect it. I am giving it to you. It's yours and all of that. And again, as you are saying, all powers centered in the office office of the president. Everyone wants to be deployed to be government. You'll make recommendations to the office of the president. So that kind of, a split personality of the organization really embodies Malema's sense of wanting to pretend that the EFF is a democratic institution. And I think in this moment, one of the things that he probably needs to do is to actually step back and ask himself what kind of a leader he wants to be after the National People's Assembly. Does he want to continue to be alienating? Does he want to continue to treat people with brute force? The way in which people are dismissed, the way in which people are humiliated in public and all of that. Because at the end of the day, whilst the organization, he may think it belongs to ground forces, there's a reason people elect leaders. And if leaders are dissatisfied and he encounters an exodus of leaders from the EFF in the next 2 to 3 years, then it will definitely take away the confidence of those who are ordinary supporters of the organization from the organization, because it will say something is wrong and all is not well inside the EFF top echelons.
Sure. You've mentioned the word meltdown in our discussion. You spoke about him licking his wounds as part of this address. I certainly found that there are moments where he seemed to be in pensive mood, almost kind of dropping the veil and unintentionally being vulnerable about just how shaken he might have been by Floyd Shivambu's exit. If indeed what he's saying is true, right? Because, I mean, there is that deployment element that you've just alluded to. I suppose the question really becomes, was this the man who was actually shaken, and is that part of the reason why it seemed he had gone off script as often as he did last night?
Well, Ayanda, you don't lose your second in command and a very trusted figure, by the way, within the EFF, and the EFF is well aware about, polls that have been conducted with EFF supporters by various research bodies. Floyd is not just Floyd Shivambu in the EFF. He's a very steady and trusted hand, or was, by quite a number of EFF members, EFF supporters. There were a number of people who coalesced around him, and I've been saying this. We've always known that there are factions in the EFF, and some of those factions were organized by people who see themselves as proximate to the deputy president rather than to the president, really giving him some sense of, support and legitimacy within the party. But I think definitely you're quite correct that Malema, if indeed this is not an orchestrated issue, if this is not public performance, he must definitely be shaken, and he must be asking himself multiple questions, because if Floyd Shivambu could leave, a co-founder of the EFF who went out on a limb with Malema to, mobilize and galvanize for the EFF, grow the intellectual depth of the EFF and ground the EFF in a robust set of ideas, whether you agree with them or not. But the EFF could explain its cardinal pillars and its raison d'etre. And therefore, Floyd Shivambu played a critical role in that journey. And if you look at that top leadership of the EFF, in actual fact, Ayanda, from its founding to where it is today, the two positions that really have remained quite unchanged is that of president and deputy president. So it shows you how critical a component part of the EFF Floyd Shivambu has been over the last 11 years. And therefore, in this moment, definitely Malema must be shaken, because he's about to be offered an entirely new set of leaders by the organization, to whom he may not always enjoy the confidence, or their confidence, or they don't enjoy his confidence, and of course trust. And he spent a lot of time talking about loyalty when he was talking about Clause 6 of the Constitution of the EFF in his opening remarks. And I think that that's where he is. He probably is wondering who is in this moment most loyal to him.
Fair enough. It'd be remiss not to speak about Sinawo Tambo and Nazir Paulson. Sinawo Tambo, of course, replacing Floyd Shivambu in Parliament. No stranger to the leadership of the organization. He's relatively young, has been the party spokesperson, and that seemed to change without any announcement. At least I might have missed it. What do you make of that? The posture that's been presented now is that, we have a commitment to young people, and this is how we're demonstrating it. At least that was his justification yesterday.
Well, I mean, you see, this is another problem, as you are saying, changes that happen without any, reasons, and yet here was Malema, traveling to Shivambu's home, looking for at least rationality of his decision, to which he says he did not receive any that is satisfactory to him. I think the likes of Tambo are an interesting, crew of young people within the EFF, like Naledi Chirwa, Vuyani Pambo, and others. Who are almost shifted and moved around at the whims of the political moods of the time. I mean, as you are saying, former spokesperson really was not necessarily up there on the list to make it inside Parliament, and is now going to benefit from the departure of Floyd Shivambu. Has almost retreated, in actual fact, from party visibility during the electioneering period, and I was actually surprised to see him leading song yesterday in Soweto, and then, of course, leading the national anthem for the EFF. And that was a marker to me to say that he's back in the fold. And again, he may well be back in the fold as Malema tries to consider how does he pack up some loyalists or people who will become loyalists by virtue of their political patronage being highly dependent on his decision-making.
Sure. What a time to be watching politics in our country. Lukhona Mnguni, as always, a pleasure. Thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Lukhona Mnguni, a political analyst, as we make sense of last night's development around the EFF and potentially its future.